Stop Falling for Logical Fallacies, Part 3. As we begin this third segment of logical fallacies, let me give you another reason why you need to be aware of logical fallacies. Now, I've already said I don't want you to be tripped up by people who are maybe not intellectual, maybe they're morons, but they're using clever rhetoric. They appear to be making logical arguments, but they're really not. So I don't want that kind of thing to trip you up. The bigger reason for me, though, is as a Christian, I think we should always avoid logical fallacies. God has given us the ability to reason, the ability to think, and we should use that ability. And we should try to have as much integrity in our thinking as we do in our actions. So I think it's the morally right thing to do that when you engage in a discussion that you refrain from using logical fallacies, because for people who aren't aware of them, they can be pretty convincing. And we should be above reproach, even when it comes to our thinking. So let's continue with some of these logical fallacies, and we're still looking at fallacies of relevance, which is all we're really going to look at from here on out. But here's another one for you, and I'll let you look at the image here for a second. And here's my example. Rabbi who sinned. This man or his parents said he was born blind. Now, you've probably heard that before if you've ever read the Bible. That is exactly what somebody said to Jesus. They presented him with a blind man, and they gave him two options. Why is this man blind? Because his parents sinned or because he sinned? Here's another example. You either want to go to war with ISIS or you're an unpatriotic coward. Now notice what's true in both cases. In both cases, you have two unfair options. And so what are we dealing with here? This is called a faulty dilemma. This is when a person states that there are only a certain number of options and you have to choose one. The way you get past a faulty dilemma is that you choose a third option. And I believe in formal logic they call that going between the horns. The horns are the dilemmas. Dilemmas are a choice of only two things. I think I've got another one here. Nope, I don't have another one. Okay, another type of logical fallacy, and you can, the image will probably give this one away a little bit. Here's an example. Have you stopped beating your wife yet? How do you answer that if you're a guy? Well, you can only answer yes or no. And either way, you don't come out looking so good. Can God create a rock too big for him to lift? If you say yes, you lose. If you say no, you lose. Because either way, God is limited in some way. And typically, this is a gotcha question for professors who want to demonstrate that God's omnipotence is absurd. They're actually misunderstanding his omnipotence. Omnipotence doesn't mean that God can do anything. We don't believe that. God's perfection actually limits him. God can't do things like lie. He can't cease to exist. He can't make another God with equal power as himself because he's perfect. A better way to talk about omnipotence or God being all-powerful is that there's nothing more powerful, or he's ultimately powerful. Don't go around saying that God can do anything, because he can't do anything. So what is this? This is called a complex or a loaded question. And a complex or a loaded question forces an unfair response. Here's another. And you can look down at my little image. A medical student says, "No one objects to a physician looking up difficult cases in medical books. Why then shouldn't students taking a difficult exam be permitted to use their textbooks?" Well, that sounds like an open and shut case, doesn't it? But ask yourself this. Is there an equivalence here? Is a physician looking something up the same as a student taking an exam? No, the two are quite different. Here's another one. It's okay for leaders in developing countries to execute people who disagree with the government. After all, to make an omelet, you have to crack a few eggs. Well, ask yourself this. Is cracking a few eggs the same as killing people who disagree with you? No, those are quite different. So what have we got here? Well, this is called a false analogy. Sometimes these are called weak analogies. And really, by their very nature, analogies are almost always weak. That is, analogies just help us to express an idea, but analogies don't really win the day when it comes to arguments. They help with understanding things, but no analogy is really perfect. But we're going to call this false analogy, and they're really bad. It compares two objects that are relatively dissimilar or makes points of comparison to draw a conclusion that does not follow. And people use these quite a lot because they think that they're very clever. Here's another one. And you can see that the rooster is crowing. The sun comes up. Therefore, the rooster crowing causes the sun to rise. Well, you know that's not true. Here's another example. Man-made CO2 levels increased and then the climate grew warmer. Higher CO2 levels lead to global warming. Boy, oh boy, this is quite a controversial issue in our age. Have man-made CO2 levels increased? Yes, they have. Has the climate grown warmer? Yes, it has. Does that mean that man-made CO2 is causing it? Not necessarily, because we've had ice ages and we've had warming periods, and it does not follow that CO2 levels are the reason. In fact, as I speak, right now it's looking like it's sunspot activity. And as I'm speaking to you, which we're here at the end of 2018, now NASA scientists are saying that because of the lack of sunspot activities, we are going into a mini ice age. So it looks like maybe sunspots could have something to do with it. Here's another one. A plague broke out, and the villagers offered sacrifices to the gods. The plague ended after the sacrifices. Therefore, the gods were placated by the sacrifices. So we've got something happening and then something afterward, and we're saying the first thing is the cause, definitely. Well, what is this? This is called a false cause. Some people you may hear use the Latin. I don't, because I have a hard time remembering them. Post hoc ergo propter. I find that really difficult to say. False cause is a lot easier. This is committed when a person believes that just because one thing followed another, there must be a causal connection. Here's another one. Oh, look at that fella down there. You know who that is? That's the Scarecrow from The Wizard of Oz, everybody's favorite character. When it comes to science and Christianity, I'll go with science. After all, Christians used to believe the earth was flat. That's a really popular saying, but did you realize that Christians never really said that? Now, maybe you could find some fringe groups who said that. But that was really an accusation against Christianity created by Washington Irving, the guy who wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and Ichabod Crane. He wrote one story which involved Christopher Columbus, and he had Columbus standing before the Inquisition, and the Inquisition maintained that the earth was flat. And so the legend arose that that's what Christians believed. But that's not what Christians believed, by and large. We've known for a very long time, really since the age of the Greeks, that the earth is round. It's clear to see. All you have to do is go up on a high mountain and you can see the curvature of the earth. So it's false to say that Christians have believed the earth was flat. Here's another one. Christians believe they are not under law. That's true. And are saved by grace. That's true. And teach that people can sin all they want after they're saved. Well, that's not true. So what have we got here? This is called a straw man fallacy. And what it does is misrepresent another's view to easily discredit it. And I'm going to tell you the main time you hear straw man fallacy, it's whenever political seasons roll around, when it's election time, just before elections. The voting record of candidates will be completely misrepresented. And I think I may have an example of that. Yeah, I got a few more examples. Political candidate A. Due to this year's budget problems, I think our state should decrease the amount of money going to schools. This would solve the problem. We could bring the amount of money back to normal next year. And then what is candidate B going to say about that? My fellow citizens, is this what you want in a candidate? Someone who's against our schools, against our children's education, and against our future. Well, that's not at all what the first candidate said, but that's exactly what they do. They will take a vote and they will extrapolate it and make the vote mean something that it did not mean. They totally misrepresent the other person. Why? Because it's easier to fight a straw man than an argument. That's why it's called a straw man fallacy. I mean, if you don't want to go up against a boxer in the ring, but if you could have a straw man who looked like the boxer, well, that would be easy to take out. All right, the next one, you can see the image. And here's the example. 72% of Americans believe that abortion should be legal. Now, that stat's not true. But what if it was true? Would that mean, then, that abortion is okay, that it's morally right? No, it does not follow. Here's another one. The consensus of the National Academy of Sciences says evolution is true. Now, that statistic is correct. But here's what needs to be considered. Most of the scientists who are members of the National Academy of Sciences believe in methodological naturalism or methodological materialism. That means their answers are only going to be material answers, no matter what the evidence may say. Even if there is evidence for design or creation, or like with the Big Bang, some outside force that must have caused it, they're never going to attribute it to anything supernatural. Why? Because they're committed to materialism or to a natural explanation. So just because that stat might be true doesn't mean that they're correct. That doesn't win the argument. This is called an appeal to the majority. It tries to prove the argument by citing a group of people. Now, before I move on from this, here's what you got to understand. It is okay when you have a discussion to appeal to the majority. Sometimes it's helpful evidence to know what the majority of experts in a certain area believe. But that should not be your argument. Your argument should be sound premises that lead to a conclusion that follows. And so just because a lot of people say one thing or another is true doesn't make it true. It doesn't win the argument. All right, we'll have one more video, and that should do it for these arguments.